Hello, welcome to the final global talk in a series of 9 global talks we've had this year. It's been very successful. There are a lot of global talk faculty in the audience right now. Thank you so much for being part of this wonderful community of global studies we've created here at Green River. And thank you for all of you who've come throughout the year. So today we have our final global talk. I've been waiting all year. For Christine Dixon, social science, anthropology faculty member at Green River College. She earned her master's degree and PhD from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Her research has been focused in Central America, and she has participated in archaeological excavations and anthropological research in Belize, Honduras, Mexico, El Salvador, and Costa Rica, as well as Hawaii. For most of her career, Chris has helped run archaeological excavations at Cerén site in El Salvador. I'm really interested in that. When I was in the service, we're in Guatemala and they didn't let us go to El Salvador, so I'm going to be paying real good attention today. Her research has examined the lives and farming practices of this Maya community that was buried by multiple meters of volcanic ash 1,400 years ago. Very interesting to ceramics, very interesting to everyone. So Chris and her wife, Andrea, just welcomed also a new baby boy, Tate, this October. So please welcome Chris Dixon.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. Proof that thank you, even if I text you with extra credit. That's why you're here. I am thrilled to get to be part of the Global Talks and this wonderful contribution to our campus. And today I get to talk to you about some research that is near and dear to my heart that I've worked on for quite a number of years. So, without further ado, we get to talk about the site of El Cerén in El Salvador. And this is a pretty interesting archaeological site. So most archaeological sites have a history of various things that happen to them after they've been lived in, right? Archaeologists know that well. This site in particular is unique in El Salvador in that it was preserved so well by a volcanic eruption. So I'm going to talk you through kind of what's so significant and important about this archaeological site, kind of take you on a tour of some of the fun. So Cerén is a Maya community located in El Salvador. So you see it here, and here we go, right here. It's what's often referred to as the southeast Maya periphery. So the Maya heartland is kind of in this area. And so Cerén is really on the edges or the borderlands of the Maya area, but it is a Maya site based on all of the archaeological evidence there. So what's happened is it has this extraordinary history of preservation because of volcanoes in the region. So a major volcanic eruption happened in El Salvador about, we'll go with AD 400-ish, 500-ish, okay? This huge Ilopango eruption is a mega eruption. It blasted into the stratosphere ash that we find around the world. Some have suggested it caused various kinds of global effects. They're still working that out. But what it did was it decimated the whole area around where Cerén is now. Cerén actually is a reoccupation after that major volcanic eruption. So the volcanic eruption turned everything into white ash across the landscape. We're talking bigger than Krakatoa in terms of an eruption. And tens of thousands of people killed at the eruption, hundreds of thousands displaced. And as we look at various kinds of global impacts of natural disasters, right, we could learn quite a bit about that from the past. So the volcanic ash covered this entire area, and Cerén is actually a resettlement of the area after that first eruption. So people moved into the region and built their household, built their community, and then 100 to 200 years later, the volcanoes strike again, this time a much more local one, we call the Loma Caldera eruption, and it buries the site again, well this time buries the site in volcanic ash. So what you have is this really nice chronological profile of a site that was occupied for 100 to 200 years, which you don't get archaeologically very often. And then you get the preservation of having a volcanic eruption. So those of you in the audience are probably familiar with Pompeii. Very similar kind of eruption that buried, in that case, the settlement. And in this case, right here is the Loma Caldera vent. So what happened with the eruption was there wasn't a volcano there. Talk about scary. They were in the middle of some rituals at the site. I'll talk you through that a little bit. And the Earth basically shifted, magma rose to the surface under the river and created a huge steam explosion. And so because of that steam explosion, the ash had very fine particles which packed around all of the archaeological remains, an entire community covered in a span of about 24 hours. And so we get this really, truly remarkable preservation. So you can't quite see it up here, but this is the inside of a ceramic vessel. And you can kind of make out some what look like dirty lines, right? That is a dirty dish from 1400 years ago. So this site is about AD 600 when it was buried, which is in an important time in the classic Maya period. And what's interesting is the way it was first found. It was first found by a bulldozer. So they were clearing an area in El Salvador for grain storage silos. They were bulldozing an area, and the bulldozer operator in 1976 ran into a structure. And he called up the local archaeologists and said, I think that we should check this out. So an archaeologist came out and checked it out, and they said, no, there's standing walls, it can't be old. Keep going. So they kept bulldozing. Unknown numbers of structures at the site lost at the time. 2 years later, my graduate advisor was in the area doing an archaeological survey. And in an archaeological survey, you do a lot of knocking on people's doors and asking, can I go on your land and look around? And so he knocks on a door and asks somebody, can I go on your land and look around? And they said, sure, but maybe you want to go down the street to the road cut where you see there's a building in the side of the road. Sure enough, he tracked out, as any good archaeologist would. And this is a picture from that 1978 first excavation. It's hard to make out, but these vertical lines here are actually the walls of this structure down here. And so, like the others, you saw this. There's no way this could be ancient. There's standing walls. Anybody who hangs out around houses very long knows things fall apart if you don't take care of them long. So what they did was they excavated a little bit, found some classic period Maya sherds. You could see the type of the ceramics, and you could tell it was from the classic period. They sent out radiocarbon dates, and they found out about AD 500, 600 is when this site dates to. Okay. So this was revolutionary, but the problem is, all of this ash is what was deposited in that 24 hours of eruption. And so, because of that, you don't know what else is there. So they became early implementers of geophysical exploration in archaeology, using all kinds of different sensory technologies to try to see beneath the surface, and kind of testing everything out. So for seismic, they would take big, huge sledgehammers and slam them into the ground and measure the reverberations. Or we'd run electricity through the ground to see what might be there. Or what's worked the best is ground-penetrating radar. Radar like you would use for planes, pointed into the ground, dragged back and forth. It used to be by oxen. Now we do it with a baby stroller. And what you see is essentially images of what might be buried beneath the surface. I'm going to take you through some of what is buried beneath the surface. So this is the main heart of the Cerén community. Now what's so amazing as an archaeologist is that this isn't just the top of the pyramids. Right? People often ask me, what's the coolest thing you've ever done as an archaeologist? What's the coolest thing you've found? And there's a lot of answers to that, right? There are fancy things like tombs of jade and working on temples, but the most important thing to archaeologists is what we can find out about the past. It's not the objects, right? So this information about the past is priceless. It tells us something we couldn't otherwise understand. So the ancient Maya site of Cerén isn't the elite. It isn't the people who sat on the top of the pyramid. This is a community that was formed of farmers, their own community, and we get to peek in and look at what that might look like. Now these structures are all made out of the earlier volcanic ash, that Ilopango tephra. They call it Tierra Blanca Joven. It's a very white-colored ash we'll talk about. So their whole community is built out of that tephra. If it were under normal conditions, without that Loma Caldera eruption, none of it would remain. We would not have found any of this without the eruption conditions. If they had been a little bit closer, they might be too deep for us to have found yet. If they had been a little bit further out, we might not have had the same preservation. So they just happen to be in this sweet spot for us, not so much for them, in terms of preservation. So this is the site center. We went a little fast there. Let's go back. Okay. So this is the site center. And what you see is this was the original bulldozer cut and the structure that we saw. So each of these represent household structures where families would live. So what we have is 3 major household structures where families would live. And what's really interesting is with each of those families, we find a public structure. We find something that everybody in the community would have access to use that's special, that's not just your everyday household. So what we think is going on is that each of these households was responsible for upkeep and maintaining and running different public portions of the community. Now that tells us something about control and who's in charge of the site, right? It tells us something about the kind of interactions that the people who live there have with each other. So I'm just going to quickly walk you through some of these. So this is structure 1, which is the domicile of this first household. We know this is where people slept because you can see this raised area here. You see it? That raised area is a sleeping platform or a sleeping bench. So in many of the Mayan structures where people would sleep, there's a bench. It actually helps us estimate population. How many people can you fit in your bed, right? To be raised up off the ground is actually a really helpful thing in the tropics. Anybody who hangs out there knows. And what we see is a very tropical structure of housing. What we see in the Maya area is you don't live in one big house, you have different household rooms. So this is the domicile where they would sleep. Right next door is what we call the bodega. So this was filled with lots of different ceramic vessels, with lots of food, and actually in the rafters, more mice than we found anywhere else at the site. So what we call it is the mouse index. If you're excavating down and you find lots of mice in the rafters, you know there's probably food inside, right? And then the last one here is their kitchen. So their kitchen was one of the unique structures in that it wasn't made out of as durable materials. It was made out of more of the wooden materials in the area. So if it burned down, it was okay, you could rebuild it easily, but more often than not, it allowed you to have some ventilation coming through. Okay. So that is household 1. We also have some really important structures associated with household 1. So this is one of those public structures I talked about. It's the feasting structure. One of the things you're going to notice is a lot of these look kind of like they're falling apart a bit, right? What happens with this kind of architecture is if you don't regularly maintain it, it dissolves, right? It goes away. And there's been lots of political conflicts over how to take care of this site. I'll tell you lots of drama later about that. Where the decisions about who can touch what and how it gets preserved are quite controversial. So this big structure, this is an artist's reconstruction that's pretty good, had a area that you could walk up and be served various foods. Inside we find lots of food processing kinds of remains. So lots of ceramic vessels, but also mano and metates, or grinding stones. The largest density of grinding stones in what we have interpreted as the feasting structure. And this roof, this is the only problem with this rendition, right? The roof would have actually extended much further out over this whole area. We know that because we find the actual thatch, which doesn't tend to preserve. What's really neat about finding thatch roof, archaeologists in the area, is that it's about 5 years or so when you replace the thatch on your roof. So for radiocarbon dating, we narrow down the window of how old something is. Also here, in the same household group, right, that household 1 is taken care of, we have the shaman or the diviner structure. So in this case, it's a very complex building that as you go inside of it gets more and more narrow and harder to navigate through. And what you'll see is these lattice windows. There's one on the front of the building, there's one on the back. And we actually have a worn path that goes between the windows. And so what's likely to have happened is people would come up here to talk to the diviner, kind of initiate the discussion, and then they would come around to receive their results. And inside the structure, we find what's termed the diviner's toolkit. Various kinds of things that are known to be associated with trying to divine futures, trying to help people understand what's going on. Okay. So these people living in this household were responsible for helping keep and take care of these different structures. there's a nice flattened area between the diviner structure and the feasting structure that was very compact, and we're going to return to this area a little later in the lecture. Okay, so let's hop over to the second household. Now that you've kind of seen in depth a little bit more, I'll give you one picture of it. So this is, again, the domicile. There's a sleeping bench right here, a bodega, lots of mice, lots of food, right, where they stored a bunch of the food. And then this structure back here is quite unique. So this is actually the sauna, or the sweat bath. And what you see the big hole in it? It had a beautiful big dome that got a lava bomb during the eruption. So one of the things that happened in this very active eruption is that magma was ejected and it would harden in the sky, and then it would land and kind of explode. Very active. And so one just happened to hit dead center on the top of this domed structure. One of the unique things, any of our architectural students in the room, previous to finding this structure, it wasn't believed that there was domed architecture in the New World until Europeans arrived. And so this actually kind of undid a narrative about various kinds of building technologies. So this sauna or sweat bath has an entrance. It's a restricted entrance. It's about this big. You crawl inside, and there's kind of a platform all the way around and a little fire pit. And you'd feed the fire, and just like the saunas any of you may have been in, right, it heats up the room. Outside of this structure are these lava stones that they put in to make these wonderful little seats. So you could go in and feed your fire and have your sweat bath and then come out and relax in the seats. Okay. And lastly, of the big group, we have this household here, which is known for growing specialty plants. They had plants other houses didn't have. Lots of these houses had very different specialties. So in this case, theirs was plants. And they were in charge of structure 3, which looks like it was the political structure. So in the Maya area, if you're in a household, if you're in somebody's room where they sleep, the domicile, the sleeping bench tends to be towards the back. In the public structures where the meetings are held, you tend to have those benches up front and then kind of a meeting room in the back, and that's what we find here, right? So you would be able to see up front, there's various kinds of platforms, and then a meeting area in the back. There is also a vessel found in the front, a huge ceramic vessel containing remains of a fermented drink.
Give approximate size.
So I'll give you in my scale, right? I come up to about here. Okay. So this is the floor, probably about here. All right. All right, so this is a zoomed out picture of some of where we are, right? You just saw all these households. That's where the bulldozer happened, the plaza in the center. So in recent years, I've been working at the site since 2004, we've excavated to the south area. We still don't know how far the site goes. We were looking for other kinds of evidence. And what we found was a lot of evidence about agriculture. So finding old food is not very common, right? Think of how quickly your own meals rot. So in this case, what we found are ancient remains of agriculture in a really unique way. What happened is the eruption packed around all of the plants that were growing. And what it did was it encased their image in the ash. So when we're excavating down, right, we're excavating, we're multiple meters into the ground, we start finding holes in the ground. And we use a proctoscope and we stick it in and we look around inside this cavity, and you basically can see an ear of corn from the inside out. You see the remain that's been encased or entombed in the ash. So the plant has mostly decomposed, there's some organic remains, but you have this casing. So the way that we preserve this, the dentists of El Salvador think we are bizarre. We show up and we ask for dental plaster. And so you mix up dental plaster, you pour it in the hole, and what happens is after it sets, you can excavate it and you can find the plants that were growing in the field 1,400 years ago. You don't want to take a bite, but you can pretty much tell what these are. So this is a cast of corn, and we found a variety of different kinds of crops. So this is a squash, and then this is the stalk of the crop manioc. If you're familiar with tapioca, it's made from manioc. Think of something like a potato. This was a really big find for us because we didn't know that the Maya were growing manioc. So manioc is a root tuber I knew nothing about, right? When the And I should say, one of the ways we knew it was manioc, the local farmers were hanging out with us and we were like, well, what do you think it is? Well, what do you think it is? And they were the ones to first say, well, what about manioc? So for years in the Maya area, people had thought maybe the Maya grew manioc. It's a crop that grows really well in droughts. We know they had corn, but corn doesn't do so well in droughts. Manioc does really well in droughts. It won't grow bigger, but it'll stay alive. So it may have been a really important crop, but nobody can find it because it disappears from the archaeological records so readily. It doesn't leave a trace like maize tends to. And so this was a huge discovery for us in terms of knowing that they actually had manioc, and later finding out how much manioc. If you're like my parents when I called to say, we found manioc, that's amazing. What's manioc, right? So this is the root tuber here, and then it has this stem that comes up. So this is the cast of the stem right next to a living plant. And you can see I'm using the scope to look into the graft. So there's lots of things you can do with manioc. You can grind it up into a flour and use that all the ways you would use flour. You can also ferment it. So we're kind of hoping they were making beer of some kind. And the trick with manioc is you have to use it within 24 hours of harvest. So you can just kind of leave it growing, but when you pull it out, you have to use it pretty quickly. This will make sense in a little bit. So this is us doing an experiment of grinding up dried manioc into the flour. We also found obsidian blades that had a unique wear pattern on it. So what that means is that the blades were being used in a particular way. And poor Teresa Hendo, who had to sit, graduate student, and cut with obsidian blades, manioc husks, thousands and thousands and thousands of times as her experimental archaeology project to see what kind of wear it would leave on the end of the obsidian blade. And sure enough, it left the same kind of wear pattern that we see in the ancient records. So it's one more line of evidence for how manioc was being used in the site. So what happened is we found a little bit, and that was really exciting. But then we started to go back and find more and more and more agricultural remains. And so we have excavated all in these areas. These are different pits. And here's some of what we found. One of the really amazing pieces is that these agricultural fields have very clear boundaries, right? What you're looking at here is a manioc field here, and a maize field on this side. And you can see this boundary right here. All of the boundaries were oriented to the same direction, 30 degrees east of magnetic north. It's the same orientation as the buildings. So you're paying attention to how you're structuring your fields in terms of the rest of your community. It's not haphazard growing. This is a very organized system of growing. And what you see is one of the ways they delineated different boundaries was by staggering where the beds would go. So these manioc plants were grown in these big, huge beds. Most had been harvested before the eruption occurred. So as we were excavating down, we were finding all these holes and all these places, finding all these cornfields, we were working in a field and we were finding nothing, no holes. And the guys I was working with were getting really frustrated. Everybody else is finding corn, and we know that because we have all the holes being found, and we're pouring dental plaster, and it's exciting. And they're like, what's wrong with this place? And as we excavated down, what we found, right, is something that's good scientific tidbit. When you don't know what you're about to find, it's usually the best time, right? So as we're excavating down, we find these big manioc beds that had been harvested. So you see a depression where they've been pulled up, and inside we find the occasional tubers that broke off in the harvesting. That's how we know they're manioc beds, and that's how we know that they were harvested. So we find a whole variety of evidence about manioc. One of the things that we see is that people grew the crops differently.
So you're saying that they were most likely harvested like right before the eruption. Does that mean like there was like a schedule for like a really specific schedule for it?
Excellent question, right? So it looks like there's kind of a big community feast happening at the same time this harvest is going on. We're going to return to that. Really astute point. So one of the things we see here is that they don't all grow manioc the same way. There are some of these kind of square, flat beds, and there are these other much larger, rounded beds. And no indications around it of why you would grow it this way or that way. And so what it looks like, potentially, is we have different styles. This is how my family grows this manioc. This is how your family grows that manioc. We've done tests to see if there's differences, and we've so far found nothing other than it's a stylistic difference. The manioc doesn't grow any differently. So some of my research, this is part of what we've been able to find. All these different individual portions of fields from different farmers. Okay. So for archaeologists, this is really exciting because we don't typically get to see any of this evidence in the archaeological record. All right, let me get you. So some of the bigger kinds of implications. In addition to our big excavations where we're documenting all these beds, some of what else we're documenting is what's in the soils. So we have what we call paleoethnobotanists, people who study ancient plants, who, David Lentz, Venetia Slotin, who've worked with us and gone through all of the soil samples we've collected and identified different pollens and different phytoliths, other parts of plants, to tell us what other species might be there that we're not finding. And we have hundreds of other species. This is important because often in this Mesoamerican region, we talk about farmers as having maize, beans, and squash. You've probably heard this in classes, maize, beans, and squash, maize, beans, and squash. The reality is these farmers had access to and knowledge of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of the plant landscape. And they knew how to use them in terms of medicine, in terms of foods, in terms of making beer, right? So this is part of how we kind of get at more information. Now back to the great question. One of the things going on at the time is that these are coordinated harvests. So the maize fields are found. If you've ever hung out in maize fields when they're about to be harvested, oftentimes what happens is the corn stalks are bent in half, right? They're bent over, and that's exactly how we find the corn stalks in the fields. We find them upside down like this, right? Because they're being ready to be harvested. So at the site, right before this eruption, right, they've harvested the maize, but also the manioc at the same time. Remember, manioc doesn't have to be harvested at any particular time. You tend to just pick it up as you use it. So this gives us some information about what's going on, right? They're harvesting all of this corn, they're harvesting all of this manioc all at the same time. Now here's the other thing if you've hung out in fields that you learn really quickly. It's not just the labor of getting something out of the ground, right? You have to do something with all of the food that you harvest. So the community had a larger event going on that was harvesting all of these crops at the same time. It tells us something about their organization. We found at the same time of the eruption a feast going on in that feasting structure. Lots of evidence that there had been a feast, including some ritual evidence like a big deer skull headdress, and lots of dirty dishes, if you will. So these are big findings. For the Maya area to know that they had manioc actually helps us understand some bigger Maya questions. So the classic period Maya had a collapse that people talk a lot about. Some people think the Maya went away, they didn't, right? There was a reorganization of their society. And lots of things probably played a role in how that all went down. One of the things people have said is there was a bad drought, so people were starving, so they all abandoned the big centers. What we know is if they had manioc, which they did, they would have had food during a drought period that could have allowed them to survive that without having everything fall apart, right? That they had various kinds of strategies for how to manage even something like drought. So a simplified explanation that things fall apart because there's a drought, now we have evidence to say that's too simple, right? That these farmers knew what they were doing and knew how to manage drought. The idea often in the literature is that people were telling farmers how to do their jobs, that the people at the top of the pyramid told everyone in the society what to do. And this is direct evidence that that wasn't the case, that individual farmers were making choices about what they grew and how they grew it. So it's one of the other big implications. Now, for fun, I never thought I'd end up being a manioc farmer. So once we found manioc, and we kept studying this, I got to know manioc very well, ate it in all its forms. Okay, we started to set up, with the help of National Science Foundation, experimental plots. So we did what's called experimental archaeology. And we set up plots of manioc growing the ways that they're grown now, right? Just kind of thrown in the field. And then we set up plots that were grown the ancient way. And the hardest thing about this study was convincing our farmers to not use chemicals. It was, in some cases, it wasn't a linguistic problem, they understood us, but cognitively, it was so difficult to communicate, no, we don't want you to use chemicals, it's okay if nothing grows. There was a very strong belief that we wouldn't be able to get good results without chemicals. What we found was the people we could convince to grow without chemicals got extraordinary results. So growing the ancient way, with this ancient method of growing manioc that's not used today, they actually got bigger tubers. They actually got more yields or more productive goods from what they were growing. Kind of amazing. And a buddy of mine, Oswaldo, here he is, we're planting manioc, said, oh, I'm going to be the organic farmer now. So we inadvertently kind of influenced agriculture in the region. Okay, so then we keep excavating in these areas, and the same situation plays out again. I'm excavating down with a group, and we're finding nothing, nothing, nothing in a place that's surrounded by maize fields. And everyone's like, wait a second, what's going on here? Maybe it's manioc, maybe it's something else, but it's a small area. What we came down on and what we found is what's called a sakbe. Sakbeold is the plural. It's a Maya word for a road, pathway. So this is a road that came in through the site settlement, and we're not entirely sure where it ends up. But it's a road that we can see running through all of the fields and into the site center. And it looks like it goes right in between the feasting structure and the diviner's. So, as we excavate and look at the roads, we learn all kinds of new things. The sakbe, when you excavate through it, so what you're looking at is a cross-section, right, a profile, inside the sakbe. So this is the top of the sakbe. And what you can probably see is how much lighter the very top is. What was happening is they were selecting out the whitest of ash to coat on the top of the entire sakbe. And so when they were coating the top of it, they selected the very fine, very white ash. One translation of sakbe in the Maya languages is white way, right? Because of the white color of many of them, lots of them were plaster coated. So in this case, they weren't plaster coating, they were using the white ash to give you that same color. One of the things that as we studied, we found is that's really good at night. If you're trying to walk and see in the moonlight, having a very reflective surface is very helpful. Now this path tells us a lot. As we excavated different parts, what we found is different ways people were constructing different parts of the road. So the road wasn't constructed in a uniform manner. Now, that's important. Why? Because what it looks like is individual groups or households may have been responsible for different sections of the road. They had to complete it in the same way, they had to have that white top, but the way that they constructed it is different from one part to the next. Again, it tells you something about how things are organized at the society. That it's not somebody sitting at the top of a pyramid telling you this is how it goes, that it's a community having different kinds of obligations to one another. All right, here's one of the canals running on the side of the sakbe. Show you a little more. This is an overview of one of our excavations. So you can see the sakbe running down the center of the excavation. And if you notice, this canal is much more uniform than this side. And what we found is actually that one side was quite uniform, nice, wonderful canal, and the other side had all been kind of stepped on. We actually find footprints on the sides that we can use plaster to cast, where people had kind of beat up the side. So one side's better maintained than the other. We looked at it, tried to figure it out, as we often do. And what happens is the sakbe is sloped towards the messy side. So the water is being drained and channeled away from the nice side and into the messy side. All right, so what we found as we excavated in the site center was that that actually had flipped in multiple renditions of the sakbe. So it had angled one direction and then it had angled another direction in its different renditions, meaning there was water management happening. Because one of the things that happens in El Salvador is you get downpours of rain that you have to deal with in the society and the world around you. We only find the earliest sakbe, earliest version of this road in the site center. which also tells us something, right? Archaeology is this kind of great puzzle of trying to figure it out. So we only find the earliest part of the road in the site center. The later ones kind of go towards the bigger villages and the bigger communities nearby and the big temples nearby. And so what it tells us is the road was kind of an internal operation first, and later extended to the bigger temples, rather than the big temple imposing it on the community. It's again a way of getting at who are these people, what were their lives like. So here's a couple more images of these canals, right, end of the Sac Bay. I'll show you a little bit more. So it tells us a bit about kind of the structure of the community as a whole. Who's in charge? It doesn't look like there's one elevated person in charge. It looks like there's a strong lineage-based community organization, meaning there's community decisions and there's community responsibilities for the public structures, for the agricultural fields, for the Sac Bay, or for the road, right? The different houses have different obligations.
I'm just curious, were the little checkered things for scale or something?
Little checkered things where?
Like on
Here? Oh yeah, that's a scale. That one?
this one?
Yep. All right. So, in all of this, we now have a better picture of the archaeological remains in the site center and the fields. Our project was then to try to figure out, where does this go exactly? How can we articulate the road inside of the community, and how far south does it go? Everyone always wants to know, where are the people? Did they get out? We've never found any of the bodies. There's been only human remains found in the lower stratigraphy. So people were able to, they tied up their roofs, they tied up their doors, and they were able to leave. We have their dirty dishes from that night. And they were able to leave and flee. We think it was at night based on some of the evidence. And they were able to evacuate. The Sac Bay would be the most likely evacuation route. So people would have left, and if you have to run away from a scary volcano that's located over here, right, this is the most likely way to run. Rather than running through the fields, you get on the road and you run down the thing that's going to be easier to run on. So most likely, if we were to continue excavating over here, if there are bodies to be found, that's where they would be found. And if you've seen maybe some of you saw the Pompeii exhibit when it was here, the bodies of Pompeii, it would be very similar to that, although probably more detailed because of how fine the ash is. Same way you can see the individual horn pops, you would be able to see individual features of the person at the moment of their death. So it's quite a brave thing to be looking at. So this was all part of an NSF grant and plan that we had intended to go and do until some violence in the community broke out. So a good friend of ours who's a local health care worker, her and her husband were murdered in their beds in front of their children. 8 people in the community were murdered in the same period of time. Gangs were having major problems in the area, and it was deemed unsafe for us to return, unfortunately. So our project has taken a bit of a hiatus at this point. NSF was nice enough to let us shift to Costa Rica and do a whole different project where we get to work with NASA and satellite imagery. But it's a sad piece of reality in terms of our work there. So the important takeaways, this critiques this oversimplified view that there are people at the top of the pyramid and there's kind of everybody else. This is a long-standing narrative in human history reconstruction, that there are people at the top of the pyramid with power and there's kind of everybody else. And it gives us a more complex view of what the lives were like of actual people, right? Not just, oh, there were farmers, but there were farmers who had power over their own society, who probably had their own trade experience, who probably had their own power and ritual, right, at their own site. So it gives us a very different sense of kind of who these people were and what their lives were like. All right, thank you. There's a lot of people whose research are on this. So one thing that I'll say, because it's the global talks, right? This piece about the violence that's broken out in El Salvador, one of the things that has done is made current issues in terms of immigration very real and very tangible to me personally, right? I have friends and family, people I consider family, whose stories are caught up in our own policies in our own country. One of the things about global studies, traveling, doing work abroad, is that you get to be connected to the world in a very different way. That you get the opportunity to connect with people in a way that allows you to see some of these big political issues or other issues in the world in a different light, right? Stories that matter to you in a different way because you've seen them, or you've talked to people, or you've lived it. So I'm very grateful that we've had this Global Studies Talk series brought to campus. It's an important thing to have. All right, questions?
Do you feel like when you were doing your fieldwork, the ideas you learned about family relations when you were in El Salvador, do you feel like it has influenced your idea of what family is?
In terms of the ancient or the modern?
I don't know.
Any of it? Okay. Sure. So there's a couple of things I can say to that. One is to think about what we often term that we live in a society of strangers here. So one of the experiences that I've had every time I've come home from El Salvador or other fieldwork in Central America is a feeling of extreme isolation. Even though I have friends and family, right? Because when I'm in El Salvador, I'm living in the modern town of Cerén, and you're constantly interacting with people. People can hear you all day long, right? The doors are always open, people are coming and going, you're saying hi to everybody on the street, people are living on the same property as you. So you have a very different sense of community than we tend to have here in the US. And so, yes, it gives me a different perspective of family in the sense of a broader community-based family, right? In the United States, our settlement patterns tend to mean that we live far away from a lot of our family members. In much of Central American areas, particularly in rural societies, people tend to live by their families and belong year after year after year, and so you have a different sense of the people who lived there. Yeah. Other questions?
Of course, I'm curious about this service. And I often, and not as a generalization, but I often associate, especially early pottery, akin to farming, that both are done seasonally. And I'm curious if there was any evidence pointing to who's making the ceramics in that area. And then the other question is, how is it different today? Has modern plastics and cast iron killed the tradition of ceramics in that area today?
Oh, fun questions. Okay, my shortest answers I can give you. So,
Yes.
in terms of the first one, we don't have any known ceramicists in the community yet, right? There's potential that there are, but one of the things that we see are a lot of the households have what we call copador pottery vessels. They're bowls and vessels that were made in Copan in Honduras and brought into El Salvador. So they're kind of a unique way that we can tie this site into the rest of the Maya world because we know those were made in Honduras. And so it's this fun way of kind of connecting into larger trade networks. So we know at least some of their ceramics are imported. The second question in terms of traditional changes, plastic is very common and used in all kinds of settings, particularly in a community that doesn't tend to have a lot of ceramicists in the local community. In El Salvador in general, there's still some strong ceramic traditions. There are some people who do replicas that are quite extraordinary of the Maya remains for sale for tourists. Some that have been so good they've made their way into the Smithsonian without people knowing that they were not. And then archaeologists had to convince the Smithsonian, wait a second, I know that that's a really good replicate, but that's not authentic. Right?
Speaking as a student here, this just goes in the same vein because it's about trade. And I was lucky enough to go on a community college communities association tour of the pre-Inca, the Mochica ruins for a month, like all over Peru. And the thing that interests me here is the spondylus shell. So that makes me think that maybe there was trade like between the Maya and the Inca because the spondylus shell was more important than gold.
Yes.
At that time, or silver.
So
what do you think about that?
we find spondylus shell throughout my area, so it's not just from that area. But yes, we think now, more often than not, most archaeologists of the New World would agree, there are extensive trade networks going all the way up and down the Americas. In terms of ceramics, but also things like macaw birds that appear to have been, and macaw birds are kind of a progressive. So how they transported those is another question. But things like jade, things like obsidian, various kinds of textiles that seem to have spread much further. The other one is food. So manioc actually originally was domesticated in South America and spread up. So what we're starting to see more and more is, rather than looking at these as isolated culture groups, that there was a lot of interconnection. So we've historically kind of drawn the line between Mexico and the US and been like, there's the Southwest, and there's Mexico, and there's Central America, and there we are. They're different. But that's not the case at all. We know historically that's not the case at all. But in the ancient past, those were not actual borders. People were coming and going in extensive trade networks throughout. Other questions?
So 2 questions. So when you were working there, to what extent did you have the support of the government, the local community, but then also the local archaeological community? And now that you're are gone from there because of the violence, is there any plan for protection of this site, or is there danger of vandalism because no one's there?
All right, so, it's complex.
It's loaded, I know.
It's complex. Yeah. So there has been various forms of the government changing in El Salvador, right, through elections, has actually changed who's the head of the kind of cultural department that runs the country. You have to have that permission in order to work there. This is also a UNESCO UN World Heritage Site. So there's other kind of protections in place in terms of doing work there. So we would work with whoever was in power in the government at the time, which changed. And because of that change, sometimes there were harder tensions than others. We would also have to work with the US Embassy so that they would know what we were doing. We would often bring them out. The Obamas came out to the site for a tour. It's seen as being a really important site for the country itself. School children come all the time, buses and buses of them. So there's kind of that public aspect. And then there's local aspects. So what's happening now is that some local groups have taken over the site. And there's been a lot of back and forth about who should be able to work in the site. And so there's some current excavations that have gone on that are done by different groups. And some of the results have not been the best, is one way I can say that. So there is some serious issues. The other thing is that the government tended to be very afraid to touch anything on the site, right? We don't want to destroy it, we don't want to destroy it. But the problem is with earth and architecture, if you don't touch it, it gets destroyed. So it's basically melting when you're not regularly maintaining it and keeping it. So there's a lot of kind of political navigating that goes on. It's not just we get to dig it up and find out this information. The caretaking of it is something we take very seriously. The other thing that we took very seriously in our excavations is to not dig the whole thing up at once, right? It's tempting, it's so exciting. But what happens is archaeologists get better and better and better, our technologies get better and better, we can get more information out of the past with time. And so you have to have a really good research question and a really good reason to excavate, because that material, once you've excavated it, you can't re-excavate it. It's a non-renewable resource.
Given chance that tensions decide to settle down, would you go back?
Certainly, yeah, certainly. It will be an interesting kind of the political nature of the site in terms of having the ability to excavate there and what that looks like is kind of an unknown. But certainly go back to see my friends.
Well, especially with the different groups that you say are down there excavating now, like how is that just one more layer of political tension you have to wade through in order to gain access to the site that your professor, he initially was there and he did that, and then he, like, would you think that yes, it is El Salvadorian history, but at the same time it's Italian. I was here first excavating this,
so
and
this
I kind of want to like know more.
This is an interesting issue in archaeology, is who has the right to excavate, whose isn't. One of the reasons that we maintained getting to excavate for so long is there aren't very many people in the world who've ever excavated a site like this. So my advisor has my graduate advisor, right, Payson Sheets, who found the site originally after he was told where it was in Broadhead. So we'll say he found the antiquity of the site. It's probably a better way to say that. He has more experience excavating this kind of remains than anybody in the world. Second to him, I probably am the next person who has that much experience at that site excavating these kinds of remains, and maybe one other graduate student from early years. And so there's not, it's a level of how much training you've had in that particular thing. But one of the things in archaeology we're increasingly working very hard to do is to include the local communities where we're excavating. So working very hard with Salvadorian archaeologists and Salvadorian archaeological students to train them to be able to do those excavations and take them over is the ideal. Yeah. The problem is it got interrupted before we could have all the training we were working on.
You're saying that they had a feast for the eruption. Does that mean that they lost what was going to happen?
So this has been one of the other questions, right? The volcanologists, so we've had experts in volcanoes come in and study all the stratigraphy, and it looks like there may have been small earthquakes happening. So perhaps the feast was in response to that. The timing of it we can't narrow enough to answer, but it is something that has been wondered, right? Are they having this ritual? Are they having this big harvest and this big community gathering in response to they know something's about to happen? I'll leave you wondering because I don't know. All right. Any other questions?
Did you bring that information back and did they change or did they
So we did. We brought that information back because the farmers we were working with were in on the study the whole time. So what we did was we planted these test plots with the farmers on each of their lands. And then we had them documenting photographically every week and kind of measuring various things for us. And then we all came back for harvests and we looked at the data together. And so they knew from what we were finding, they were able to see it themselves. And they know better than we do. Right? They're far better farmers than I will ever be. But they were able to see the real difference. And I think I told you my buddy Oswaldo was he was so thrilled at this opportunity to see how much different it could actually be using some of the ancient planting methods. In the community today, it's so easy to grow manioc that they haven't really switched over to the big beds that take a little bit more, although some of them have kind of dabbled with the idea of, I'm going to build some beds. We haven't seen them yet.
So it's interesting that they felt so dependent on the chemicals for growing, because the one thing that Central America has in common with the Northwest is that, you scrape a piece of land bare and 10 minutes later something just grows.
Yeah.
It just,
Oh, yeah.
and it grows big.
Oh, yeah.
And yet, what do you know about that? About who, agricultural experts, who's convinced them that they needed chemicals?
So what is really interesting about it is people themselves will say, how do you plant manioc? And they'll cut up the stalk and they'll throw it out the window and be like, there, done. Because it really will grow, right? But then we go in to do this experimental plot and everybody's convinced they have to use chemicals.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting kind of juxtaposition of perspectives.
Yeah.
The town of Puya de Cerén is a resettled community for the local factories. And so what part of it might be, I'm guessing, right? I'm kind of making an educated guess of families having been relocated into new areas. One of the things about farming is kind of knowing the land and knowing the microterrains and the microclimates of what's happening. And so if you take families and move them to a different place, they may not have the same kinds of knowledge of the land or faith in it, so maybe at that point is when chemicals became such a common piece. The other thing that's going on in that particular community is the Rio Sucio runs by, named for the sediment load of the river, the Rio Sucio. However, multiple factories moved in upriver, and the older generation will tell you they remember the day the fish all went out of them. So the river used to be a vital resource to help people who didn't have enough to eat, right, and had to try to rely on other means. It used to be a vital resource and it went away almost instantaneously. So there's also kind of the levels of pollution that are impacting various aspects of the community, unfortunately. On that side of it. Any other questions?
Another positive note?
Sure.
Okay, so with the new technological ability to collaborate across countries through collaborative online international learning, do you think that if you could have like a facilitated relationship with the anthropologists that are there right now, would you continue that like virtually if you?
Certainly, and we have some really great anthropologists working in Salvadorian archaeology. So there's lots of kind of complex divisions of the politics. So there are some archaeologists that we're still in very good touch with and very good communication with. Roberto Gallarta is an archaeologist who did his work at UC Boulder too. And so he's somebody we've collaborated with a lot. And he's working in the major museum of the country, running a lot of that currently. So there's lots of collaboration, but there's a divide between the museum and the kind of government archaeologists. There's a lot of behind the scenes of who gets power, which happens and plays out, particularly when you have this find that's so extraordinary for the country. It's such an important find to El Salvador. They talk about, we don't have the big pyramids of Guatemala like Tikal. We have Cerén. And so because of its importance in that way, because of being a World Heritage Site and its publicity, lots of people like to be involved in various ways and don't always agree on how they can be involved. Yeah. Thank you. You all have been an extraordinary audience.